Right, okay, now we are back, right? And our next module that we're going to go into for week 2, right? In module number 7. And I'm going to talk about MIDI. I'm going to do a little short introduction of what MIDI is, okay? Now, everyone's heard of MIDI, right? You all heard MIDI this, MIDI that. Everyone is familiar with MIDI. I'm just going to go a little bit into the background and the history of it so you can sort of understand and see, what the role of MIDI is. Besides just having your MIDI controller and stuff like that, MIDI is actually very, very powerful, okay? It's got so many other uses and implementations as well. Let's head into, without further ado, let's get right into it. Introduction to MIDI. This takes us back to the late 1970s. So this is like what? This is like 50 years ago, man. By that time, electronic musical devices were becoming increasingly common and affordable, okay? Now, actually not really affordable, right? Because like in the 80s, right, one of the very highly sought after devices synths was called a synclavier. It cost like 150,000 US dollars back then, okay? 100 plus K USD back then. Very few people could afford it lah, okay? Okay, so, but basically what it means that, when they were playing around with synths and synthesizers, right, those modular synths, it used to be all those modular synths, the different modules, and the synthesizer is as big as the whole room, okay? You take up the whole room because you have all the modules and all that. You have to manually take the cable, plug in, plug out, and then all that. You see, you want to connect this oscillator to this, to that, to the to the the envelope generator, this and that, and everything lah, right? Manually you have to patch in one, and everything is unstable. If the voltage or electricity is a little bit unstable, the pitch also can go off one, right, in the middle, okay? But you'll be surprised, these modular synths are actually making a comeback. It's very, very popular now, okay, because people are maybe they're bored of all the software synths and everything. It's actually got a very strong market and user base. So a lot of the manufacturers are coming out with all these modular synths. Of course, now everything is a lot more modern lah, right? In terms of the pitching, the tracking, everything is a lot better. Components are better. You don't have the same issues like with because of your electricity voltage unstable or something like that, then the note also goes off one. So very surprising, all these old technology is still around and making a comeback actually. Problem back then though, the devices from different manufacturers, right? So for example, if you have a Roland machine or you have a Korg machine or a Yamaha machine, they generally are not compatible with each other, right? You could not interconnect, they cannot communicate with each other one, right? Like a Korg machine, you cannot connect with a Yamaha, for example, right? They don't talk with each other. So this guy, audio engineer and a synth designer, okay? So his name is Dave Smith, or the company is called Sequential Circuits Incorporated. If I'm not mistaken, the synth that he designed is called the Prophet or something like that, okay? Right. So he proposed the MIDI standard in 1981. So he's the one who proposed, okay? Okay, this is the MIDI standard, right, in a paper to the Audio Engineering Society, right, AES. Come to August 1983, right, they published the document called MIDI Specification 1.0. So today, Dave Smith, right, is he's generally regarded as the father of MIDI lah, okay? And MIDI technology is currently standardized and is maintained by the MIDI Manufacturers Association, MMA, okay? Not Mixed Martial Arts, okay? MIDI Manufacturers Association. Then move forward a couple of years. In 1991, they developed something called General MIDI, a GM for short. Even though you had MIDI in 1983, it takes a while for the industry, it takes a while for the manufacturers to sort of implement and to reach kind of a standard. So yes, MIDI was around, but to get the different manufacturers to agree to have a sort of a standardized kind of sound bank and patching and presets and all that, it took a while. Okay, it took so long. It took like 8 years. In 1991, only they standardized. So in 1991, they standardized General Midi. It's an attempt to standardize the orchestra. Okay, orchestra means that all the different instruments that can be included inside your General Midi sounds. So if you go into your any kind of a keyboard or a synth or something like that, you go to your General Midi bank, right? Your GM bank, you will always find a GM bank. So it'll always be 001 will always be grand piano, it'll always be piano one, okay? Then if you go to 002, it's I can't remember. Honky tonk piano or whatever. Okay? Something like that. So what happens is that across all the different manufacturers GM instruments, okay, right? GM will only have the 128 program voices lah. So you have your 128 GM presets, okay? So anywhere you go, any machine, it's going to be standardized to that, right? So whether you're on a Korg, you are Yamaha, you go to another one, you go to that GM patch 001, it'll always be that same piano sound lah. So it helps to standardize, see? But as with all manufacturers, they always try to outdo each other. So Roland, they expand the GM a little bit further. They call it GS. Yamaha call it XG. So all these companies they're trying to one up each other all the time. So let's move on. So what is MIDI? That's a little bit of a background and a history of of how MIDI came to be, okay? I should probably update this a little bit further because MIDI 2.0 actually was just implemented this year. Yeah, a new set of specifications that really expands the capability of MIDI lah. So MIDI 2.0 was just announced, can't remember, January or February only, very recently, right? And implemented. I think because it's so new, not many people really understand or know, or the manufacturers, right, are taking fully advantage of the what's inside MIDI 2.0 specifications yet lah. It always takes time lah for the industry to sort of catch up, right? They introduce the standards, right? Then it takes a little bit while for the industry, the products, to sort of catch up to it. So that's a bit of history of MIDI, okay? So what is the definition of MIDI? Okay, MIDI is an acronym for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. Musical. Why is it musical? We could refer to it as musical because it's a musical performance language. It's basically code, right? It's basically bits and bytes, digital ones and zeros that can be transmitted electronically. So MIDI involves the use of an instrument. So in this case, instruments here, we're talking about synthesizers, right? Your synths, your samplers, your computers, right? Now, hardware generally, right, will always have your MIDI ports, okay? And it's still important until this day. A lot of hardware still have these MIDI ports, right? You have MIDI ports. They're labeled. Basically, there are three. There's an in, a MIDI out, and a MIDI through. Okay. So next time if you go behind your MIDI controller, you take a look lah. Right. You will usually see these. At least you have an in and out. Right. Maybe the bigger synths and the bigger keyboards will have a MIDI through. Okay. So now, these are all connected using special MIDI cables, right? So MIDI is a digital, okay? It's a digital. It's a protocol. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a form of serial communication that uses digital values, right? Language of ones and zeros. Okay, MIDI is also an interface. It lets two systems communicate, right? The human and the machine, or sometimes between two machines also lah, okay? And machine here is not only limited to musical instruments. MIDI, as I said, right, has got a very, very wide application in lighting, even in let's say even the world of guitars, right? Guitar effects pedals can also be programmed, can be controlled with MIDI. Machines can all be controlled by MIDI as well. Moving on. Okay, one thing, okay? Here's a very miscommunication, okay? And MIDI messages, right? MIDI signals cannot be heard, okay? MIDI is not audio, so a lot of people actually, especially laypersons, they always confuse. It has happened before where where somebody wants to send files to me and say, okay, I want you to mix this song, okay? I have the piano, but the piano I did on MIDI, okay? All right. So I thought, okay, in my head, I assumed that, all right, what they did was they bounced and they exported the MIDI, right, the MIDI track which they played and they programmed. they exported the audio for me lah. But sometimes actually they send the MIDI file though. It's like, why you send me the MIDI file? You know? It's like then I don't have your exact patch. I don't have your exact sound patch. You see, I cannot recreate it, right? So there is sometimes the miscommunication, right? So as I said, MIDI messages are not audio, okay? They can't be heard. They don't fall within the range of human hearing. Okay, now, this is what MIDI actually is. MIDI is actually a kind of musical notation. It's a code. It's just like when, we refer to as tauge lah, right? All the notation, Western class, the formal notation, all the minim, the crotchet, semiquaver, all this sort of stuff. But one thing about MIDI, okay, unlike our musical notation, the Western notation that we have, which represents actual notes, actual sounds, and all that. MIDI doesn't represent sound. Okay, it doesn't represent any sound. It represents, right, as explained over here, it represents musical gestures. It represents actions. It represents it's a set of instructions. Okay, so these instructions, these gestures, tell the instrument, it tells whatever device to start a note, play this note, okay, bend the pitch, okay, by how much, release the note. So MIDI messages are that. It's just instructions that tell the machine what to do. It is not a sound. There's no sound actually. So MIDI messages are transmitted via MIDI channels, okay. Now it can be compared to television channels, all right. If you remember what terrestrial and free TV is, okay. Right, so we compare it to television channels or cable or internet or satellite TV channels now lah. So each TV station will transmit on its own numbered channel. Same goes with MIDI. Okay. Now there are 16 MIDI channels. Okay. By default, there are actually 16. I'm not sure whether MIDI 2 is going to expand that or not lah. So something maybe we want to go back and research and take a look at the official document. The official document is very long lah. It's a white paper lah, so it's boring scientific documents. Whoever wants to spend the time reading it, okay. So very interestingly, okay, MIDI is transmitted, okay, at this general knowledge lah, right, 31.25 kilobits per second, kbps, right. So by this day and age, MIDI is actually quite a low bandwidth data, you see. I think MIDI 2.0 is also trying to expand it so it can, be a lot more versatile. Moving on, MIDI hardware configurations. Now, historically, MIDI cables use a standard 5-pin DIN plug, but nowadays it's increasingly common, right, to be MIDI via USB or Thunderbolt already. It's increasingly common to use that. This is typically, right, behind any kind of device. As I mentioned, you have a MIDI in, you have a MIDI out, you have a MIDI through, and that is a DIN cable, right? A 5-pin DIN cable. Okay, so your MIDI in, it receives the MIDI messages, okay? MIDI out, transmits, okay? It's for transmitting. So the one that people get confused is MIDI through. What is MIDI through? So MIDI through, what it does, it makes a copy, right, of the MIDI messages that's arriving on the in. So it takes the copy of what's in the in and transmits it out to the through. And it's very, very handy. It's very useful in bigger setups. Okay, moving on. So in MIDI, there is usually these two relationships, okay? And in fact, with a lot of audio devices, so you hear this. Master and slave. Now, okay, a short sidetrack, okay? AES, right, international. Not only that, a lot of the broadcasting organizations, right, are actually kind of looking into this. And I'm not going to sort of debate whether it's the right thing or wrong thing to do. I know I'm not in a position to sort of debate and to explain it. But because of the word master and slave, so now the more sort of the world viewpoint, the liberal viewpoint on this kind of thing is that, this kind of word you cannot use, right? You cannot use the word master and slave because, for political correctness and wokeness. So they are actually doing studies right now, right, to implement and to rename this lah, right, to use some other kind of word instead of master and slave. For example, like in Cubase, right, there's previously, right, if let's say you have an incompatible plugin or an incompatible VST, right, it enters into what we used to call the blacklist. Now with Cubase 10, it's not called that. It's called block list already. You know why? Because it's offensive to say blacklist, right? So a lot of companies are moving, just for general knowledge lah, okay? Your personal views are your personal views lah on this topic, okay? Right. So I'm not in a position, we are here not to argue ethics or social awareness or wokeness, okay? It goes to even further to even things like some countries, and US being one of them, some European countries also, when you describe a house or how many rooms, right? You can no longer use the word master bedroom. Yes, it's true. It's true. They no longer, you look at the brochure and everything, right? The salesperson will describe, okay, this is the whatever lah, main bedroom or something like that. They refer to bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3. They won't use the word master bedroom already. Because they say that, oh, it implies that the master used to stay in there and then the slave used to stay in the other's room, you see? So, but that's how our society and culture developed lah. Nothing to do with music production, okay, right? Just a sidetrack, a little interesting thing, just to let you know they're actually looking into it. So in the future, you might see devices with a different way of labeling out. They may call it primary or secondary or something like that. It's okay. Primary, secondary is all right also. Yeah. So back to the topic, okay? Back to the slide. So the instrument that is receiving the information, right? We usually refer it to as the slave. Okay, same also with digital audio and all that stuff, but we'll talk about it later. The slave, it must be set to the same MIDI channel being used by the master instrument or the one that's transmitting lah. Okay, it could be a computer, could be a keyboard, could be a sequencer, anything like that. Basically, the MIDI cable, right, from the MIDI out of the master goes to the MIDI in of the slave lah. Right, so this is a basic setup. You still need to know this because actually there's still a lot of hardware devices that still have the MIDI port. Again, a slight sidetrack, this is not in the notes. There is some argument why some higher range, like the higher range interfaces and the higher range still maintain the MIDI. Now, I'm not a keyboardist. I'm not someone who is using implementing a lot of MIDI. I'm not a keyboard player. But for them, I think the integrity, the stability of the signal is still better if you use a dedicated MIDI cable, right? Because it's specifically transmitting the MIDI information, right? Instead of a USB lah. Because USB, you are sharing the bandwidth with your printer, your mouse, your whatever device, your interface. So there is some arguments and some debates that, you know, having a specific proper MIDI cable is better lah, right? Right, and you still see it, the manufacturers still make devices with the MIDI in and MIDI out ports. Okay, so now let's look at some of the configurations, right? So this is important. It's well, if you're not someone who uses, right, a lot of keyboards and synths, maybe for you it's not so important. So I'll just cover it anyway. So there is what we call the daisy chain, right? So daisy chain is mean you chain from one to another, right? Device 1 to device 2, device 2 to device 3, right? So a daisy chain, it provides multiple slaves, typically to one master in a serial configuration. Serial here means in series. Means that serial means you get from point 1 to point 2 to point 3 in series. You cannot jump, you cannot skip. Let me go to this graph. It will explain to you lah. So for example, on the left from the DAW, right, or your other machine, that's your master. You will go into slave 1, MIDI in, and then out from the MIDI through into the in of slave 2. So this is what we call a daisy chain configuration. Okay, now there's some pros and cons to a daisy chain, and we'll move to that in a second. The through box, okay, or star. So this is what we call star configuration. Anybody who's IT background? Actually, it's so similar, no? If you are into an IT background, right? Daisy chain, star configuration, all the network configurations, similar concept, similar idea. So with a star configuration, you get multiple slaves to one master in parallel. Okay, so it's different. Just now it's series, so that means you from one machine, you have to go from slave 1 to slave 2 to slave 3. Parallel is not, you can go directly. You can link to many slaves, right? From one master, you go to a through box, right? Then it parallels out to all the different slaves. So there's a difference between the two. Now the fourth one, okay, is the MIDI switcher or matrix. Okay, this one is a little bit more complicated, right? So this one you can link multiple slaves to multiple masters, right? So you usually can use a MIDI IO or MIDI switcher that you can. So this one is of course a lot more flexible if you're somebody like Hans Zimmer, for example, so many synths or something like that, you are hooking up all your different synths, right, and your different sound modules and stuff like that. So many of these switchers, right, of course they have onboard memory lah, so you can recall the presets, okay. Otherwise it'll be very complicated. For example, this is a Motu MIDI Express 128. So various configurations. Again, moving on. All right. Now this one is more. You don't really need to know so much, okay? But just to let you know. Okay, so your MIDI instruments usually have a couple of receive modes: poly, omni, and multi. Okay, I'm not going to explain too much into detail. Okay, so poly mode receives and responds to only one MIDI channel. So you can still play polyphonic, but you only respond to one MIDI channel. Okay, you can also go to Omni mode to respond to all 16 MIDI channels. So sometimes you may have applications or situations where you want, right, the machine to respond to all the MIDI channels. So multi-mode is a little bit more complicated, right? The name also, the definition also is, okay, a little bit long-winded. Assign different timbres within a multi-timbral instrument to different multi-channels. Okay, but basically this is when you talk about layering, when they are layering different timbres, different pitches, right, and then you can assign it to different MIDI channels. So it's just an increasing level of complexity lah. So a couple of things, right? So you will sometimes encounter the word SMF. So SMF is acronym short for standard MIDI file. Sometimes you will see a .smf. Sometimes you will see a .mid mid. Right? It's the same thing, right? It's actually the same file, just have a different file extension. So now here is something that may be important if you ever need to export MIDI files to someone lah, right? The option to export the MIDI files, you will see down there, whether you want to export it as a type 1 or a type 0. Type 1 is the most common and it's kind of the easiest and simplest, because what it does, it will contain the separate information for each track, okay? Now, type 0, the file is merged into a single track, but MIDI channel information retained. So when you load in a type 0, it goes into one single track, right? But the MIDI channel information is retained. It's a little bit messier, right? But again, these are it's some of the legacy things which, it's since 1980s, right? The standardized. Nowadays, it doesn't really make sense, right? So very cool. Let's very quickly go, right? MIDI messages transmitted as multi-byte packets, being a status byte followed by 1 or 2 data bytes. Okay, not important don't need to know. This is to help you to understand what MIDI actually is, okay? As I said earlier, it's a set of gestures, it's instructions, okay? It's not sound. There's no sound. A MIDI message has got no sound. So when you press a note on a keyboard, for example, you press the middle C just now, ding, okay? With a velocity of 40, okay, so about medium velocity you're not pressing it hard, medium. So what it does when you do that, it's actually 3 messages, right? It sends a MIDI message number 90, right, which represents note on or note off. You press it down, it sends a MIDI message 90 telling note on. When you let go, note off lah. Then it also sends another message, 3C. Okay, this is actually hexadecimal code lah. Okay, again, if you're IT and all that, then you know lah, hexadecimal. So 3C here represents middle C, the middle C note. So it's telling that number 3, 40 here represents the velocity, right? So in MIDI, you know, right? When you work with MIDI, you have this velocity from 0 to 127 lah. Okay. So as I showed you just now when you're doing the drum samples, right? Everything 127, yeah, your kick drum all the way 127. It sound like a what we call the typewriter kick drum lah, okay? Because it really sounds like a typewriter. So this is what actually happens when you press a MIDI note. It's not just, it doesn't trigger a sound. It's actually telling the synth to, okay, turn on this note at turn on the note at this middle C with this velocity. It's just a set of instructions, right? The machine itself is dumb. It doesn't know what to do. You're just telling it what to do. Right, so MIDI messages will fall into 5 categories. You have channel voice, okay? right? For you, what's the voice lah? Okay, what you tell you to switch to a different preset, a different sound. Channel mode, okay, defines instrument response, okay. Okay, you have system common. Okay, again, these are not very important for you to memorize lah. Okay, system real time and system exclusive. Okay, system exclusive will maybe useful. Okay, because now system sysx for short. Okay, sysx is where we have things like MIDI time code, right, or MIDI machine control. So right, if you know lighting and all that, MIDI time code, this is all used to sync, right? Because you can use a sequencer like Cubase or Pro Tools or whatever, and you can program all your MIDI changes, right? And that's using all your MIDI time code lah. So your lighting, everything can be all programmed and programmed within your DAW one actually, right? You just press play. If you already sequence your whole show, for example, boom, lighting, everything, pyrotechnics, smoke effects, whatever, all these kind of machines, right, can all be sequenced, right, within your DAW inside your MIDI machine. So you just press play, it will trigger. So the MIDI notes will send out to all these different machines, send out to the lighting, send out to where you want the blinder, the spotlight, everything. It's very powerful. So MIDI is actually more, it's not just limited to our keyboards and synth, right? It's involving all that as well. Okay, MIDI machine control, maybe tape machines and all that, those analog tape machines. Okay, some of the devices will use that as well. All right, okay, so this brings us to the end of this module. Okay, so gives you a little bit of history, a little bit of insight, the background of MIDI, how the MIDI configurations are implemented. Okay, and also how MIDI has a wide use, right, beyond that of just music or inside the studio, right? Okay, cool. We'll move on to the next module after this.